we have 90 minutes together for this session entitled Bad Behavior Won't Stop with Punishment. Great. Thank you, Heather. Um, awesome. So there's a couple ways that we could go about this session. I have some materials that I've generated for my organization to frame the problem statement in a different way, and it's actually how we treat survivors, which rolls up into this title, which is bad behavior won't stop with punishment, because what we're doing and lots of the way that we enforce the law is punishing people who we've identified as offenders, but we've glossed over the fact that they had been victims many times before that, and so we're actually punishing survivors in lots of ways. But I don't want to lose sort of the energy coming out of the last session, and so we can do something a little bit less formal and just have an open dialogue, as open as we can through these screens. But I want you to just take a moment and think about that while I tell you a story about this kid, Antonio. So I spent a lot of my time as a prosecutor, particularly when I was prosecuting juveniles, working with them either in the community or in detention. And I use that term really loosely, and don't mean to oversell what I was doing, because I know, particularly for folks who are working more on the social service side and the child welfare side in the detention facilities and in aftercare, that y'all are doing a lot more work than I ever was. But part of sort of like what I got known for at the DA's office in adult court and juvenile court is that if anybody went to detention, the first person that went through the door with them after the court officer was me. And we would have a conversation in the hallway, and then I would go and visit them. And so one young person who we're going to center this conversation around today was Antonio. I met Antonio on a gun case. It was one that I diverted the first time around because actually the evidence was bad. It wasn't a case that was going to go anywhere, and so it was diverted. But when he was diverted, I didn't see him again for another 2 years, which I said before was a win. And sadly, after I left the DA's office, I heard that Antonio had gotten locked back up again, and it was for another gun crime. Only in this case, he was charged with not just possession of the gun, but shooting the gun. And in the shooting, a bullet struck a construction worker in the leg. That construction worker was one of those construction workers that was doing work over the graveyard shift, and he was the victim on the case. Antonio was arrested not because the evidence against him was great. In fact, the evidence against him was this really grainy surveillance video that showed someone who certainly could have been Antonio, but the thing that connected Antonio to this figure that is in the security camera is another security camera from another store in the area where Antonio and his friends show up. Long story short, a gang unit officer sees this grainy surveillance video. That is the identification. Antonio is the shooter. You see the muzzle flash. There's no evidence that even if he was the shooter, that it was this shot and not the 30 other shots that went off, are actually the one that struck the construction worker. But none of that really mattered. He was locked up, and he was locked up for a long time. And I had the benefit of going to see him when he first got into the juvenile detention facility, and I would start visiting him monthly. And over the course of that time, I saw on the positive side him really engage with leadership and the staff in a way that got him actually a lot of privileges, including being on our JDAI, Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative committee. So the committee had a seat for incarcerated youth. I think that's lovely. Impacted voices are really important. And I remember watching him and hearing about him, thinking like, okay, this is all a lot of really, really good stuff. We want to preserve this because this you can turn into and channel energy into somebody who ultimately is really successful. But on the negative side of the processing of this case, and it was literally just processing, he ended up being in pretrial detention in the detention facility for a period of about 18 months. And at the end of that 18 months, the case finally goes to trial, and it's a garbage case. I go to the prosecutor, and I say to him, you know, what are you doing? We've already got 18 months out of him. He's got the opportunity to do really, really well on the outside if we surround him with the right supports. But if you try him and you convict him, he's got to go back in for 18 months, and he'll go to the adult system. And the prosecutor said something like, if I don't prosecute him, then I'm going to get in trouble. I don't want him to go out and do something bad after this. And it's a shit case, and so I probably won't convict him anyway, which is the most problematic statement for me, because like, if that is true, then we shouldn't be trying the case in the first place. But it is a culture in our office, and so the case went to trial. And it was a 7-day-long trial with lots of witnesses, lots of evidence. Again, the evidence against Antonio didn't get much better. It's basically all that was presented tying Antonio to the shooting was the video of him at a store down the street, within 10 to 20 minutes of the shooting, and then this grainy security footage. And on the sixth day of the trial, I went and I sat in the courtroom, and I was sitting behind Antonio, and Antonio turned around and he looked at me and he said, hey, bro. And I was like, Antonio, pay attention. You're on trial. Like, this is very serious. And he smiled and he said, do you see those girls back there? And I turned around, and there were 4 young law students, young women, observing the trial. And Antonio smiled and he said, do you think they'd be into me? And I laughed at how ridiculous the question was, both because they were 10 years older than him and probably had no interest in dating a teenager who was on trial for shooting someone. But then I was just profoundly sad and frustrated that none of this had any meaning to Antonio, because it was designed by people who did not understand kids. And it was in that moment that I was again affirmed in this sort of like ridiculous environment that we try to resolve harm in, and we try to fix kids in, that this is the best way that we thought about it. And so the day 7 of the trial came and went, and I was traveling, and I got a text message that said not guilty. And so Antonio was acquitted, and I was happy for about 30 seconds, because the next question that came up was, okay, well, now what happens to Antonio? Because for the 18 months that we had been holding on to him in the Department of Youth Services, and for the 7 days that we had been trying this case, not once had anybody asked the question, well, what if he's not convicted? What if all of a sudden he just goes home? Because there was without any case, there's nothing for him. And I bought him a hotel room that first night. I got him a hotel room the second night. By the third day, his cell phone was off, and he was in the wind. And lo and behold, 4 months later, he was locked back up with a gun. And I tell you that story not because I particularly like talking about failure, but because, again, I like talking about ROI. And I think about it's $109,000 a year to incarcerate a kid in Massachusetts. So you do the quick math, 18 months, $109,000 a year. You're looking at, call it $150K that we spent just holding on to him. And then you think about the cost of a 7-day trial, the cost of 12 jurors' time, the cost of all of the people, all of the bodies that make transporting him back and forth to the detention facility, my time, the time of my colleague who second sat me, the public defender's second seat, the bailiff, the several police officers who came and testified, the experts and the judge, all of their time. And I think about all of that cost and how we spent it. And we didn't address the problem, which was the behavior that we didn't want to see happening, which is Antonio carrying a gun. And in fact, we did such a poor job at it that within 2 months of this happening, he was caught with another gun. And so it really framed this problem for me of trying to end behavior with punishment. We're never going to be able to do it if we don't really, really stop and understand that deterrence, this idea of deterrence, is one that did not come from like a scientific person. There is little evidence that the criminal justice system solves to deter people from crime. We certainly deters me. Like, don't get it twisted. I don't have any interest in spending more time in prison than I already do. But also, like, that is a privileged thing for me to say, because I also recognize that the reason I'm not out here robbing people is not because of the threat of prison. If I do rob someone, it's because I don't actually have to rob anyone. I don't not deal drugs anymore because my dad arrested me. It's because I don't have to sell drugs to make a living. And so this idea that deterrence is the driver of behavior, or the incentive that we can use to get people not to commit behavior, is a flawed one. And I have empathy for why we think that way. Because I grew up in an Irish Catholic neighborhood, and so for any of you who knows how it is growing up as an Irish Catholic, like, punishment is part of life. You're grounded. I was an 80s kid, so like corporal punishment was still a thing. And there, I can understand how, standing at college graduation, I could look back at my life and say, I'm here because my parents were strict. I'm here because when I screwed up, they punished me, and I learned right from wrong. But what is sort of like privileged and ignorant about that statement is, it wasn't the punishment, it was all of the other stuff, the ecosystem around it, the love, the support, the safety, that allowed me to make that behavior change, and just the fact that I grew up. And so not only are we talking about punishing trauma, we're also talking about punishing someone out of like natural progression development. And when we do that, we miss an opportunity to understand that the solution to our problem is not the punishment of victims. I mean, the punishment of defendants. It's the service of victims. And if we can get our minds around that and think about a different metric system of success, then I'd like just to see what would happen, because we don't do that well. And so if you can see me, then I'm going to try to do something here. Just stick with me for 1 second while I do this. Just calling a little bit of an audible here because we had some AV technical problems with the what's it called? Connects. So just one moment. Here we go. Don't mind the branding on this training. It was for someone else, but it's just as good for you. Share screen. Share this. Share. Okay. Everybody can see this? I'm gonna guess yes. So when I set out to think about this problem, I thought about this young man His name is Servulo. Servulo, I met again when he was very young. He was 16 years old, and he came to my courtroom for threatening a neighborhood kid with a gun. Nobody ever saw the gun, but it was a violent crime, so it came to me, and because of the way that I sort of like framed prosecution, I took all the time in the world to get to know Servulo and his family before I made any decisions. And what I learned about Servulo is what I learned about lots of the young people that I worked with, that he had a long tail of trauma dating back to when he was born in an island nation called Cape Verde off the coast of the United States, or off the coast of Africa. And all of that was sort of manifesting at this really critical part in his life. And every time they showed up to court, his mother was just lamenting about Servulo and his antics, and all that we could do with the court was the same shit we had been doing all the time. We would get child welfare system involved. Servulo would get removed from the home. He would run away from the foster home. He would commit a crime. He'd get arrested. He would come in front of us. We'd hold him on pretrial detention. We'd litigate that case. We'd resolve that case. He was almost never incarcerated because the infractions were almost always really low level. But that was the process. And the reason that I show this photo as opposed to others that I have of him is because I want you to take a moment to think about this moment for you, whether you were the person holding up your brand new driver's license, or whether it's one of your kids or someone that you've mentored, and just like think about this moment, because for me this is like those humanizing times when we can understand that despite the fact that Servulo and I grew up in completely different neighborhoods with completely different experiences, we still had these moments that can center and humanize Servulo for me in a way that a police report and a criminal record never will. And I show this image because 2 months after this image, Servulo was dead. Servulo bled to death in the front of a car by himself, stabbed 3 times, and everybody took off and let him bleed out and die because they were afraid to call the police because of what might happen to them if the police came. And there was no news about it. It actually was reduced to 1 sentence at the end of an article about some other people who had more privilege who were also killed that weekend. And when I heard about that, I was really frustrated because, again, I thought about all this time that we had spent on trying to punish Servulo out of the behavior that ended up leading to his death, and we had spent none of that time or effort or money trying to resolve the harm that had been done to Servulo. And so I usually ask prosecutors this question, but I'll ask you this question. When it comes to understanding crime victims, I would give our profession an A+ to an F- if there's still such a thing. I'm going to just ask you to think about it, and if you want to, put it in the chat. While I'm doing the slides, I can't see the chat, so I'm going to let you throw that in there. I will tell you that most prosecutors and law enforcement give themselves at the best a C in this regard, and most people are giving themselves a failing grade, which is a good thing. Acknowledging that we're actually not great at understanding crime victims is part of problem solving for us. And so here's where we're going to go into design thinking and thinking about a future, thinking about metrics that we can dig in around and start focusing on, as opposed to using a punishment model. If we go to a health model, my assessment is that we will be better off because we have access to victim service providers almost everywhere in the country, regardless of if you live in a really, really rural community or a really, really populous one. Victim service providers are out there. And more importantly than the current existence of victim service providers, there's lots of money to be had to build these things. So when we say victim service providers, we mean any organization that serves victims exclusively and in part. That can look like material services, so door locks, cell phones, rent assistance, psychological services, really that wellness, that care, and the things that I never understood to be victim services. Includes organizations working all throughout the justice system, community campuses, and hospitals, and more. And for me, again, this is allowing myself to have humility, but also empathy for myself, because I know that I caused a lot of harm when I first started dealing with victims because I didn't understand them, and I didn't understand what they needed. I lived a pretty privileged life. I was victim of nothing that I could remember. What happened in the orphanage, I did not remember. I had a lovely life, and so I was conditioned to believe that when someone was victimized by a crime, the service that they needed was incarceration. Uh, and so someone would get hurt, and they would call the police, and the police would come and arrest that person. I thought in my mind the best thing that I can do for this victim to make them safe is to make sure that this person is incarcerated and cannot hurt this person anymore. I did not understand the network, the ecosystem of things that would arrive at safety for victims more than incarceration. So really boring stuff. Since 1984, since the signing of the Victims of Crime Act, over 32,000 laws have been enacted on behalf of crime victims. And that 1984 date is important because those years were the beginning of really the buildup of mass incarceration, particularly around violent crime, because there were some national cases that had really sympathetic victims that led to national outrage, that led to legislation, and that legislation blossomed all over the country. And part of that legislation yielded a lot of funding, and that funding yielded a lot of victim service providers all over the nation. In fact, today there are currently 12,000 of them existing. And since 1984, funding has more than tripled. Even under this last administration, funding was pouring in the door from $745 million in 2014 during the Obama administration to a high of $4.4 billion in expenditures alone. That is not to talk about the amount of money that is still actually currently sitting there. There are billions of dollars still sitting in the government for crime victims. And when we look at where victim service providers are, again, in my mind, when I thought about like if I'm harmed and I need services, the places that I would find those are at the doctor's office or at the hospital. But sadly, what we've learned is that a very small percentage of victim service providers are actually at hospitals. Most of them, as you can see from this chart, live in the nonprofit space, or sadly, with us, the government, the DA's office, and the police departments. And so just this information gap for me was appalling, that I didn't know that this disparity existed in where people were. And I had assumed that if they were coming from the hospital, which most of my victims were, then the hospital was taking care of the services that they needed. We know all of this because the federal government invested a lot of time in developing these tools to learn who crime victims are across the country, so we can really, again, using data to get our minds around who folks are, and then how victims of crime are receiving services in the aftermath of their victimization. Those are the tools. If you're interested, we can spend some time on the slide, but I'm going to, for the purposes of our time together, just fly by it. What did we learn? I talked about this earlier. Number one thing, the thing that we should be shouting from the rooftops, particularly as organizations that love saying, but what about the victim, is that we don't even talk to half the victims that are out there of violent crime. They do not pick up the phone, don't call the police. And as a result, we don't see them. For those of you working in other sectors that are adjacent to the criminal justice system, whether that's child welfare or education, particularly special education, you might get access to those victims in a different way, but this statistic here is hurting all of us. And this, again, is 2018 or 2017 data from the Trump White House. And it is a national victimization survey that they created, and 200,000 people participated in. 57% of survivors of serious violent crime, as opposed to regular violent crime, did not report to the police. Serious violent crime are your sex assaults, your shootings, your non-fatal shootings, your non-fatal stabbings, home invasions, that's serious violent crime. These stats don't affect, they don't contemplate homicide. So these obviously victims don't report their own homicides, but these numbers actually get worse when you add in homicide, if you can believe it. Only 36% of victims of serious violence who suffered bodily injuries were reporting, and only 56% of them were receiving medical care for those injuries. And so of 36% of victims, only half of them are actually receiving care. And that is important because what the data revealed was victims are more likely to access services when they receive medical care. It's kind of obvious, but I wanted to say it out loud because it's really, really important to understand the chain of events that if they don't reach out for help, then the likelihood they receive medical care for their injuries is reduced, and as a result, the likelihood that they have access to services is really, really reduced. So going from reporting of crime, which are really, really abhorrent numbers, this should scare us all. 90.4% of crime victims did not access services. They did not access services. And so removing from our minds that the criminal justice system has anything to do with services other than we hold on to a bunch of them, even people who were involved in the criminal justice system did not access services. And when we look at young people, 18 to 34, but these numbers actually get worse when you go down to the 14 and 19 range. Parents will report for their kids, but parents are still very unlikely to engage in service providing, not because they're bad parents, but we'll get to lots of the reasons around why these numbers are so low. 92.1% of young people were not receiving services. Of those groups, 5% who did not report the crime received services. And the hope would be that people who did report the crime, there would be this like ballooning improvement in that data. But sadly, even when people did report crime, that access to services only went up by 8 percentage points. Looking across genders, fewer than 1 out of 10 men injured during a serious violent crime report accessing a victim service provider. 1.8 in 10 women report that access. Gender disparity in that access, I think we can all imagine why there might be that disparity, centering around masculinity and how we've cultured around masculinity. We're not going to do the reflection just because we're between screens here. But then let's talk about disparities. Compared to white citizens, Latinx people are 1.5 times more likely to serious violent crime. Black people 2 times more, and Native Indigenous people 2.4 times more likely to experience violent crime. And oftentimes it's intra race or ethnicity, but these disparities are also contemplating inter racial violent crime. But again, when you see these statistics, and if you're thinking to yourself anything but a response to how people are victimized, as opposed to some other reason that these disparities show up, that's when we have to check our bias. If we are looking at these numbers and trying to justify them by any other thing than it is how we treat these folks when they're victimized, then we have to have a further conversation about biases, because our skin color and where we're from is as meaningful to our outcomes as our hair color. This shouldn't shock anybody, but I want to put it up there. If you think about the person who is the most victimized, men of color under the age of 35 who live in urban households with incomes under 25 years old or $25,000 are 2.8 times more likely to be the victim of serious violent crime than a similarly situated white male. So a white male under 35 who lives in an urban household with an income of $25,000 or less. And again, I want you to pause and think about that. That if you took a white young man and a black young man, you put them in the same exact environment, that black young man is almost 3 times more likely to experience serious violent crime. And again, you can look at that stat and let your mind fool you into believing that there's something about being black, whether it's this myth about absentee dads or rap music or our culture or whatever. If you start going down that pathway, then I'm going to ask you to revisit and ask yourself, like, is that it? Or is it what we're going to talk about in a moment, accessing services? You blow up that chart and you think about the most victimized person in this country who are black males under the age of 35 living in urban environments and with a household income of under 25K, and you put them on a chart with the least victimized person in this country, a white female 55 or older living in a non-urban household with an income of $75,000 or greater, the disparity is 15 times more likely. A black man living in poverty is 15 times more likely to experience serious violent crime than an older white lady in a suburban household in an affluent neighborhood. And this is important when we go back to the slide about the amount of funding that has come into victim services, the laws around victims' rights, and I want you to pause for a moment and think about where all of that funding has gone. Why might that funding have gone there? I want you to think about the laws that come up in your mind when you're thinking about those national cases that have resulted in victim right laws. Polly's Law, Megan's Law, Amber's Law, Marcy's Law. There are these laws that have driven policy and dollars into victim services, but they're almost always going to the population of people who are the least victimized, and not the population of people who are the most victimized. Sorry, that is a reflection that I want you to think about in a moment, so that when we get off the PowerPoint, we can do this in the group breakout room. I want you to think about what is the relationship between the victim demographics and the incredibly low access rates that we just heard. Think about the victim demographics and the access rates that we just heard about. And so if we were live, or if we had the ability to be talking to each other, not through a chat box, we would be doing this in a different fashion. Why might access rates be so low? I want you to think about that, and we'll come back to it in the chat. But we'll just throw up some barriers to access, right? There are linguistic and cultural barriers. I was talking to a jurisdiction in central Colorado where they have this massive population of migrant farm workers who are constantly in the criminal justice system because they're victims of crime often. And this office, the DA's office, didn't have the victim rights sheet written out in Spanish. Cultural barriers. And so if you think about cultures that believe that victim mental health is not part of safety, cultures that believe that participating in the criminal justice system is inappropriate or degrading. You have attitudinal barriers, just the trust issue. You have physical barriers, transportation. I know, particularly in a state like Nebraska, physical barriers come in the way a lot more than any of these others. And then last is being stewards of information, that the people who are staying on the front lines of these systems have the information available to us in a way that we can share it, but not just share it like in the way that I was taught, which is hand people a brochure. Share it in a way that shows that I understand what I'm giving you, that I'm an ambassador of what I'm giving you, that I will help you make the connections to what I'm giving you. And if it fails, I'm not going to blame it on you. I'm going to understand that isn't a good fit for you. And last, what we can talk about is what opportunities does that create for us? Because we know that the implication of not receiving services as a victim are twofold. One, If you are not receiving services, and this is what the data bore out, if you are not receiving services, particularly when you're not receiving services as a victim of serious violent crime, the likelihood that you are victimized again goes way up. The likelihood that people around you are victimized goes way up. And the likelihood that you perpetrate violent crime goes way up, either in retaliation or somewhere down the line as the byproduct of manifested trauma. And so all of this bad news actually provides us with lots of opportunities that I'm looking forward to talking about in our breakout time. We can reduce barriers in really creative ways. If we think about, again, the list of the kinds of barriers, we can build relationships with the organizations that exist that are providing services, both material and health services for treatment of harm. We can advocate. And so recognizing that this collective group of people that we have is a really powerful lobby. And we can advocate to the federal government, to our local government, to our local stakeholders, to the public for access and more victim service providers and less punishment-based interventions to crime. And finally, becoming better stewards of information and just seeing what happens. And so I'm going to go back to our screen here. And let's just open it up. I know there was a lot of Fast and Furious information at one time. But the presentation part is over. I don't find that there's a lot to be netted at these conferences if I just stand up here and I'm just doing the PowerPoint. I would really, really love to hear from you. Questions, comments. But before we get to questions and comments, I'd just love to see in the chat. Let's go back to the first question of what do you think is why do you think that there are such low access rates to victim service providers, and particularly when you think about how they break down along racial, ethnic, and gender lines? Let's just put into the chat. Well, first, you might already have put it in there. Yep, you did. I see Becky, Catherine, and Andrea, F, D, F. And so I'd love to hear other people. Give yourself a grade and try to put your mind in at the beginning of this presentation, not after I've given you all this wonderful information. How well do you think you or other stakeholders that you work with that come in contact with victims understand victim services? Just give you a few minutes to throw that in the chat. D, Christine. D, Jessica. F, F. D. And I'm wondering, as people put in their grades, people, thank you, Doug. Vicky, thank you. I'm wondering if people are putting in, as they're putting in the chat, these grades, if you can articulate why you're giving that grade. Amy, maybe tell us what a good day looks like. Why did you choose the grade that you are choosing? Some thoughts on that. Because giving the grade is one thing, understanding where that grade is coming from and how we can improve is how we grow. So would love someone to just put in the chat why they chose the grade that they did. Lack of empathy. All right. And Jana, I'm gonna reframe that a little bit, because when we say lack of empathy, what some people hear is you're a sociopath. And I do think that there's an empathy issue, but I know, working in this business for as long as I have, that it very rarely is it because somebody's a sociopath. It is because they have not been invested in with tools and the life experience, frankly, to work with folks. So that's great. Because distrust in the system that is purposely and strategically built against, like, focusing on this word trust is really important. It is so funny to me. It's not funny. It's sadly ironic that I spent my entire career from the day that I started until the day that I finished. In the daytime, I was a prosecutor. In the nighttime, I was a bartender. And I received so much more training and feedback about how I was serving people as a bartender than I ever did as a prosecutor. And part of the training that I received and really indoctrinated and incorporated into my time as a prosecutor was the reason that people came to my bar every night and sat down and would spend $200 is because they trusted me. They trusted they would have a good time. They trusted the music wouldn't be too loud. They trusted the lights would be right. They trusted the food would be good, and because of that trust, they would continue to return and they would get good experiences. And instead, in the daytime when I was a prosecutor, if a victim didn't choose to participate, I was conditioned to blame that victim. You don't care about your kid. You don't care about yourself. You're crazy. I heard that often, like calling victims crazy because they didn't want to see the person who hurt them go to prison for a long time. See some other things really quickly. I think of attending to victims' needs. We think we get justice. We've gotten our job. Christine, like this is something that I deal with all the time. And again, I understand where that comes from. I understand that two things have happened. One, we've been conditioned to believe paradigm justice, and two, and so our first inclination when we are harmed is to want to see the person that is harmed us be harmed, and that is natural. It is natural only to human beings, but that is natural. But the reason that prosecutors actually exist is that victims of crime used to prosecute their own cases. And shortly in the middle of the 17th century, early 18th century, there was a decision worldwide. It started in France, but it eventually made it to the United States, where we took the ability for victims to prosecute their own cases away from victims and gave it to a representative of the government. We called that person a prosecutor. Does anybody know what was happening at the time in this country, where we looked at the model of victims prosecuting their own cases and said, maybe that's not the right thing? Extra credit for somebody who can nail this history lesson. There were things happening in this country that made us pause and say maybe victims who are caught up in their emotions are not the best stewards of justice. Anybody want to take a guess? Come on. Nope. End of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century. Good guess, Doug, but this happened way before. Anybody want to guess what was happening in this country that would give us pause about victims trying their own cases? Another good guess, Doug. Getting warmer. A little bit earlier. Going for extra credit here. Come on, folks. There's 100 out there. Witch trials, winner, chicken dinner. Salem witch trials are sort of the worldwide example of the worst case scenario. What happens when we give the power with a particular man? We're really pissed off and made up a story. And that story eventually ended up in the killing of 300 people. The public prosecutor model, but we just recognize that there needs to be an independent prosecutor. So it's really interesting that over the last, particularly in the last half of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, we have gone back to that place where we prosecute based on the emotion of victims. Exists. Amazing. All right. So Heather also added, we have done a couple of things in this exercise. We have given ourselves a grade. Doug, I think, gave us the highest grade. But agreement that there's room to do better. And now the fun part for us is we have ways that you think to solve the problems that you put down below. And so just take a minute to reflect on that. And when you have the opportunity, put into the chat, for example, I'm going to use Amber's definition, or Amber's grade. Amber gave us a D. And again, because we only have name recognition of services, we're poorly versed on what many organizations have to offer. If we were in a design studio, we'd see that as like a fun problem, and then we go into solving mode. And so let's think about if you want to look through the chat again, or if you have other things that have come to mind about your grade, please put into the chat what we can do to transition those problem statements into a solution. Go. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to do that. What can we do? So give me an example of something that I did. This is similar but different. This was dealing with folks who were intervention. They were going to go to state prison, technical violations. The judge would scream at them, and then they get people would bring their kids in the hope that the judge wouldn't lock them up with their kids in their arms. That didn't work. People would come with all sorts of paperwork about the jobs that they were interviewing for that next week. That didn't work, and it was really frustrating to sit there and watch it because because I knew that we weren't resolving the problem. That sending them into the state prison was not. It might give us some respite for a little while, but they weren't doing super long sentences. They would be back out in the community and then be driving harm again. And the reason they were being violated, even in the ones who were being violated for new crimes, weren't being violated for new crimes that exceeded or were more severe than the cases that got them on probation in the first place. Typically, there were crimes that we probably could have foreseen, like driving on a suspended license, trespassing because they were homeless, theft, writing bad checks, drug and alcohol abuse because they were medicating, and they were violating terms of a contract that we created with them that was intended for them to be safe or to live a better life. But lots of the things that we were asking them to do, we actually put a lot of barriers in by giving them a felony conviction and putting them on a GPS bracelet. I remember sitting there watching this and I was like, what? What is going on here? I said, why don't we try something different on Fridays? Why don't we create a program, particularly for these high risk guys, and call it Choice? And it wasn't some sexy, fun acronym. It was literally just like the idea of the program was to let young men and women choose what they did on probation. It was choice. Obviously, we built frameworks around it. Your choices were limited to 4 buckets: employment, education, self-improvement, or community service. If all the other 3 failed, the requirement was that you did 16 hours a week of any combination of those 4 things. And if at the end of the week you showed up at our session on Fridays with your documentation filled out, you got a week and you got a week off the back end of your probation. And so the algorithm was, if you had 2 years of probation, which was the typical length of probation for the young people in this program, if you did everything right from day 1, you could work 6 months off the back end of your probation. And then within a year of the program starting, you just saw these radically different outcomes. And it wasn't because people were, it wasn't because of any one thing. It was a combination of all the things coming together. And so the ability to choose what I wanted to do on probation allowed me to do something that I actually wanted to do. It wasn't being thrust upon me. And so when I said batterer's program to somebody, in the old way, I used to put people on probation, as opposed to getting them to the point where they're like, I need some help from my anger, and letting them choose into that. That helped. Friday, instead of Friday being the probation surrender session where you might go to jail, Friday and there just being a time to come and convene with other people in your cohort to talk to the judge and prosecutor and the defense attorney about what was going on that week. And it allowed for us to build human relationships and connect them with services on those Fridays, as opposed to sending them to jail. And then the best outcome was, because of that trust bond, because of that relationship building, not only would people be accountable when they showed up and they didn't have their hours done, but instead of us shaming and locking them up for that, they were accountable for those actions. They knew that they weren't going to get the week off the back of their probation. They would double down and come back the next week. And in the best case scenario, I had people self-reporting. They'd say, hey man, I'm going to test dirty this week. Or, hey man, I caught a case this week. Or even better, they would text me and say, hey, I'm about to go and do something dumb. And so that's just an example of what I'm talking about. And so I'll go back to the chat here. I see we need education to build skills. And find attitudinal change. Invite me to get you started. Great. Jana, you're not a plant. And just want to call that out. Thank you. Early childhood education on life skills, restorative practices while immersing in youth of our village, building those developmental relationships to spark our future, meet each one where they are, and genuine validation without judgment, do no harm. Love all of those. Amber, service providers need to be provided the resource and the access to decision makers within the system. Too often, nonprofits are working on shoestrings, do not have the capacity to share the message. Solution is thinking outside the box. So if we, amazing. All of those are incredible. So now I want to go back and we're thinking about the cultural, so physical barriers, attitudinal barriers, and cultural or language barriers. I would love for people to share in the chat examples of working with either victims of crime or young people who are coming to your doorstep on their way because they're on probation, because they're in the child welfare system, because they're incarcerated. And think about the moment, we say it all the time, this young can help. Instead of framing it like that, let's go back to the customer service lens and think through, what is it about us or our system, either cultural or attitudinal, structural, geographic, attitudinal barriers there are, and just share some examples of that being the case, so we can, again, what we're doing is problem identification, so we can turn into solution-based thinking. So again, I'm going to give you a few minutes to think through it, think about examples or ideas you can share. And so one thing might be that our family justice center that we spent a lot of money building, that was meant to be the place for crime victims, particularly child crime victims, to go to get to. It's an example. And so please, that you estimate might be why people aren't. Come on, folks. Get in what you get out what you put in. So throw in the chat examples of barriers that you have experienced or you've observed, either crime survivors or your young people that are coming in the other way, engaging in services. I know you have examples. Help us out here. Oh, how do I get out of here? Lack of providers here. Barriers to transportation and services. Different priorities in education and achievement in cultures. And then youth are placed on probation for truancy, and we use the same approaches we do with youth raised in the United States. For someone who's been their parents don't have transportation or they don't believe it to be necessary. All right, let's unpack a few of those. They have huge barriers and you have limited time and resources to truly make an impact. I had audio issues. Do hope I understood. Yes, Tara, this is perfect. And so I'm hoping people are seeing these as examples and thinking of their own. Please contribute, because this is really, again, we are in design thinking mode, and part of design thinking is recognizing problems, calling them out so that we can turn them into solutions. Lack of providers is always an issue, and it's one that we are going to tackle together. Marina, different priorities in education, achievement, and cultures. Could you unpack that a little bit more for us? And Heather, I'm going to ask you to do the same with the end of your quote, your chat. They don't believe it is necessary. I just want you to unpack that a little bit more. I think I understand what you're saying, but I don't want to assume. And Michelle, realizing that youth of color need cultural programming to address some of their problems. Would love to have you unpack that a bit more as well. Not including the family in the discussion, us deciding what they need. Huge, huge, huge. And I see this happening all of the time when we, because of cultural differences, because of this lack of trust, when parents don't engage, we immediately have judgment about those parents. And sometimes we're right. Sometimes we're right, and another thing can be true, which is they might not want to participate, and it might be because we feel that they don't care. But we also have to understand that those parents were young people as well, and a lot of this is just the same manifestation, the same trauma that's just been untreated. The parents don't support the services recommended. Yep. And let's talk about that, because I hear that all the time, and it works both ways. I had lots of parents coming into the justice system asking me to send their kids to Scared Straight because they thought that was a program that could help them, and they got really, really mad when I told them that I was not going to send their kids to Scared Straight. So if we were running a business, if we were running a restaurant, and We had our menu outside. We had great food. We had a chef that was really, really good. We had great cocktails, but nobody was coming to our restaurant. One way to say that was the customers don't want to support our services, our restaurant. Another way to say that, and the way that most restaurants do, is what are we not cooking or doing or showing or whatever to empower people to come into our doors. And so why Heather and folks, I'm hoping that we can include Heather, help Heather out. What is it about the services do we think might cause the parents' refusal to buy in? So Jalissa offers families and parents' refusal to take the children in, getting them to buy in, fear of more intrusion into the home, causing parents to put up those barriers. And so Jalissa, what Jalissa is talking about right now is really, really important. This is why it's important for us to also understand like historical context here. And I'm going to say something that might be like super jarring, but what Jalissa is talking about right now, actually, we can trace back to slavery. The way that we got enslaved people to quote unquote buy in to this economic dynamic that we had set up on plantations was by separating them from their children and using their children against them to get them to perform work. And as Brian Stevenson says, slavery was never abolished, it evolved. There are still lots of ways that I'm sure lots of us can think about that cultural vestige still lives in our system. And I will own that in the following way. I had lots of domestic violence cases in my first year as a prosecutor, and I was trained to offer the services of housing and all the things that domestic violence survivors actually wanted and needed to be safe. I would use all of those as a carrot to get them to participate in the prosecution. And if they said, I don't want to because they were afraid to see their loved one get locked up, I would say, then you can't have those services. That, to me, in reflecting, is the perpetuation of things that emanated during slavery. And I say that not to say that we are slave masters and we're not better than those people. I'm saying that to understand that generationally we have a lot of work to do to build trust back into our system. There's lots of comments in here now. This is great. We need to come more from the perspective of power with the youth and the family instead of power over. That's a great flag, Chelsea. Gwen offers an attitudinal barrier, not understanding that children model what they see, but it is not too early to teach problem-solving youth and for families. Parents are very distrustful because they can sense bias. Gwen, I'd love for you to unpack that last one a little bit more when you say that they can sense bias, because I want to dig in a bit there. The parents never needing services like we were offering when the parents were growing up. Incredible, insightful point, Tyne. I really like that. Parents believing that they've already tried what you're providing, right? We do a really, really good job of offering, but we don't do a great job of understanding and holding folks accountable. And this is true. This is less true in places where there's scarcity of resources. It is more true in places like where I prosecuted in Boston. We had 109 youth serving organizations in our city. And that is not to say that we use them all. In fact, as a prosecutor, I knew about one. I had to take the time to go out in the afternoons and discover the bounty of resources that we had. But we were all using the same one, whether you were in the Department of Youth Services, Child Welfare, the DA's office. We were sending all of our kids to these like 1 or 2 programs, and parents were just sick and tired of hearing them. And again, if you are offering the mozzarella sticks over and over and over again, when the mozzarella sticks are trash, people are going to stop coming to your restaurant to order anything because they never get past the mozzarella sticks. And I'm not trying to be glib or funny. What I'm trying to do is get you in the mindset, particularly those of you who have worked in the service industry before, to understand the analogs. And really, the reason that every business in the private sector spends a lot of time listening to their customers and including that feedback is because of a revenue model. What we have to understand is our failure to do that. Sure, we're not making money, but our currency that we're dealing with is something it's much more valuable, which are human lives. Parents sometimes want us to parent their children or be the enforcer. Randy, that is like, I cannot tell you the number of parents who came to our justice system to act as a surrogate parent. And what that was met with by typically this one judge, but in some way, shape, or form, everyone, was just the admonition: we are not the place to parent your kid. We're not your surrogate parent. And I understand that being the message, but as customer service stewards, as public servants, we have to develop a language that is better, that is more asset based than deficit based. So instead of saying we are not your surrogate parents, we should have an incredible amount of empathy and say something like, we're sorry that you felt that this place was the best place that you can come to have what you need in your home. And sit in that moment and just build trust slowly with folks by meeting where they are, calling out the hard thing, doing so without judgment, and then moving right into problem solving. And so I really, really appreciate that comment, Randy. And this is particularly true. I should know, but I don't, better sort of like the ethnic makeup of some of your jurisdictions. In Boston, we had a tremendous Somali population, and it was a recent population. I say that because a lot of the parents of the children that I was prosecuting were immigrants from Somalia. And in Somalia, one of the last countries on the planet to send kids to prison for life without parole, kids were disciplined differently. And when folks came to the United States and they wanted their kids disciplined, they would bring them to the courthouse to get disciplined. And so just really understanding cultural competency and how I could turn that situation into one where that parent now doesn't trust me. And if something else goes on in the home, they're going to choose to do something else about it, or to receive that information, process it in a way that generates a trust bond that won't result in me being the enforcer or the parent, but will result in what ultimately happened was me going out and finding a Somali community-based organization that had much more cultural competency around how to deal with the problems that are going on in the home. Just go through a few more here. Prior experience and distrust of the system again. Amarina expanded on her comment earlier. Working in Mexico and previously in Southern California, education standards are met at an earlier stage, and youth are expected to work and contribute to the family. Yes, this is real, and I would even push the comment to there's an expectation for young people who have lived here for many generations, but poverty has created this need for them to be adults much quicker. And to it actually, for any of you who are working with youth who are getting into college, a conversation that we need to have as a community is keeping those kids in college, because the reality that when they come home to see their families, that draw of, hey, you're not putting money on the table right now is real, and we lose a lot of kids to that reality. Bias is a trigger. Youth of color are disproportionately charged and disciplined for actions that all youth have, but are treated differently. Youth of color have to have programs that teach them about the systemic, institutional, and organizational biases. Michelle, I love that one. A Know Your Rights program, which, for some reason, we, particularly in law enforcement, shy away from. Like, people got really upset at Colin Kaepernick because he started this Know Your Rights program for youth. But what I found as a prosecutor who built a Know Your Rights program for high school students is it generated a ton of trust by empowering young people with how to talk to me, how to talk to the police. It actually created a trust bond, a respect level, where those young people then opened up to me and told me about things that were going on in their community that helped me out. Okay. Now that we've spent a ton of time talking about problem identification, what I would love to do for the rest of our time is let us like sit in what we've just put in the chat. Think about all of the barriers that we've talked about, historic, contemporary, structural, transportational, resource-based or non-resource-based. Just take a moment to review all of your colleagues' chats. Give everybody a moment to thank each other for contributing to this discussion, which is really hard and not, I understand, not particularly engaging given the format that we're doing it with. But now I want us to do something that's hard for us, particularly when we're looking at a bunch of problems, which is to understand our agency to solve those problems. And so what I would like to do for the next couple minutes is offer what we can do as individuals, what we can do as organizations. And so if you think about, I'm an individual prosecutor, my organization is a prosecutor's office, and I work in the field of prosecution. And so let's just focus on some of these problems and ask ourselves those 3 questions as we close out our time today, because I want to commit to each other that we are going to use whatever power we have, our agency as individuals, to make these changes. Because again, if we look at the grade that we gave ourselves, we have to have some accountability to get that grade up. We can't push it all on leadership. We can't push it all on waiting around for other people to do something. As I indicated earlier in my comments this morning, we have to be the civil rights leaders of our time. And so let's just do individual action steps that we can take, and we can start tomorrow so that we can inspire each other and we can really take these ideas and shoot for the moon. Like, I don't want you to think about what can I do right now under all this stress and all this time. If you had the time and if you have the resources, what is one individual change that you can make, or what is one barrier that you can reduce, and how would you do it? Randy, build relationships where we had very limited time, opportunities, maybe 3 to 6 months. All right, Randy. So you just did a very natural thing that we do in design thinking. I had to wrestle this cobweb out of my body. If you get the but, that but is actually a second problem. Okay. So build relationships. Cool. I've identified a second problem, that is we don't have time. And I always find time as a barrier that people in systems, including myself, are running up against. And again, this is where we talk about the hamster wheel. Like, the reason that we don't have time is because the way that we've designed things. And so what I'm asking you, Randy, and others in the room are, okay, if a solution is building relationships, but a barrier to building relationships is time is actually the problem that we're trying to solve for. So what are some ways that we can build in time without net widening or keeping kids in the system? Because when I see the time barrier, what I go to is thinking about how I'm spending the time I currently have. And Julissa, I think, rightly offered volunteering, but I'm gonna take it back. I love the spirit. I'm gonna take it back because what I don't want to ask you to do is cut into your time. What I want to start with is the time that we already have, and thinking strategically how we might use that time differently. And this goes back actually to a question that we got in the other room about mandated reporting, rules and regulations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want us to think very, very critically about how we're spending our time and the outcomes that we're getting. And I'll use this example as one. When I was a prosecutor, I was trained my first few weeks that for any victim case that I got, I had to request the 911 tape. And I say tape because it was a cassette tape at the time. And to get the 911 tape, I would have to fill out my file. Then I would have to read the police report. I would have to print out the form that was the request form. I'd have to fill out the form with all the details that I'd have to get from the police report, which wasn't easy because, lo and behold, we're not great at writing police reports. They're usually happening at 2 or 3 in the morning. For people who have been working a long, long time, the last thing they want to do is provide me, a shitty lawyer, with the information that I need. So you're taking the time to fill out the sheet. Then I have to take that sheet to the fax machine. I fax it over to the Boston Police Department. I have to wait by the copy machine, stand there, because the sheet that comes back that says we got it is evidence. It's discovery. And then I would wait another week. I'd get the tape back. I'd listen to the tape 2 or 3 times because they're unintelligible. And then I would have to copy that tape for defense counsel and for probation. And what we know about kids is rarely are they committing crimes by themselves. And so that means I was making multiple copies of tapes for multiple defendants. And if I thought about the number of times that I did that for the tens of thousands of cases that I had, and then I think about how many times I actually used the 911 tape in the time that I was a prosecutor, I can say without blinking an eye that I used the 911 tape in the prosecution of my case, or I saw the defense use it in the defense of their case 5 times. 5. And so all of this time that I've spent filling out forms and doing what the rules said prevented me from doing what I should have been doing, which was being out in the community and generating relationships. Be a better listener. Mary, how are we going to do that? That is an easy, we say it all the time, listen to people. All right. Well, I feel like I've been listening to people all the time. Yes, Jalissa, this is great. That's the energy I want coming in here. Understanding that even in the most resource starved areas, there are human beings that take a lot of love and pride in their communities. And so visiting the public library and just seeing who's down there, asking around. We were in Philadelphia, which is a resource-rich area, I'm not gonna lie. But it wasn't a program that I found or a nonprofit or a government service that I found. It was actually this guy who came to the public library at the same time every day, and helped young Black men and women with their homework on the computers at the library. Continue to be and develop evidence-based interventions, programming, resources, and connect through community. Andrea, how do we do that? We're not gonna leave this room making general statements. We're going to design exactly how we're going to do those things. And Jalissa, I want to push you. How are we gonna find the time? This goes back to Randy's time question. How are we gonna do that? What is one thing that we can think about doing to do those things? Oh, and I love seeing a connection. Melissa, yes, call Randy. Come on, folks, more suggestions. I don't doubt it, Andrea. I love that. How many of your teammates are? Reiterating to families and service providers that we all need to share decision-making responsibilities and work together to the same positive outcomes and goals. Okay, Chris, I'm gonna be the devil's advocate by using the word reiterating. You are suggesting that we've already said it once and twice, and frankly, probably 5 or 6 times, and there's not the uptake. And so that again leaves to me the problem statement being the access to information is not happening, or the communication isn't happening. And so what about using the community boards for ideas to connect? And awesome. Heather is now in solution mode. What about using the community boards? What would be the implications of using the community boards? So now we're offering solution, and the implication of that solution is what, Heather? What if we do that? Yes, Jalissa. Get out of your buildings. I know that's harder to say in COVID time, but go out. Talk to young people. Social media partnering. This is it's hard for me now. I'm 40 now. Even when I was 25, 26 as a prosecutor, trying to find these kids on social media was difficult. But when I did, it provided me so much access. And I got in because I was conditioned, or I was trained that social media is where gang stuff was happening, and it was a great place to collect evidence. But instead, I looked at it through the lens of information gathering to make diagnostic decisions. And you could predict and see a lot of behavior that was about to happen and intervene. And so it created the opportunity for me to, somebody asked about snitch culture earlier, to send a Facebook message to a kid to say, hey, are you all right? You want to talk to somebody? And lo and behold, you start to generate these relationships, which don't have to be out in the open. Like Ja'Cory Lyons did not want anybody to know that he was talking to a prosecutor on Facebook, but Ja'Cory also felt safe enough to reach out and be like, I need $40. I'm going to rob somebody. There are resources posted there. Provide that information to youth and let them find what they need. Community boards, service lists, teach them to fish and not just give them the fish. Yeah, Randy, for sure. For sure. Mandy, be proximate to those kids. Like I already said, go out. COVID is an excuse. Not just know the community resources, but who at the community resources make things happen. This could not be a more important point. Mandy, thank you for bringing it into the room. One thing I never understood about poverty, rural or urban poverty, however you want to look at it, was that the road to services between myself and those services looked very different than someone living in poverty to those services. There were lots of barriers in the way that we're talking about. And one of them was just not only am I asking them to trust me, but now I'm asking them, if I refer them to a program, to take a leap of faith and trust that person over there. And you can do a lot of work, and I think that's what Mandy is getting at here, of accelerating that trust building growth by saying, instead of me being a prosecutor saying, Judge, I'd like to refer this young person to Bridging the Gap. It's over there in Dudley. I could say, Judge, could I have a moment with the family? I talk to the family and say, hey, listen, I have a program. It's over in Dudley. I know that's difficult for you to get to from where you're at, but we can help you with transportation. Jovan is over there this afternoon. Why don't we go up to my office, give him a call, and refer him? And now you've reduced several barriers because you have a relationship with that person over there. So Manny, that note was really, really important. Andrew, I have 7 children. It's bigger than me. I place girls circles and boys council. I love my community. I'm connected with our youth and our families. I want people to model that behavior. Andrea, could you talk about, so this for me is where really rubber meets the road, because we've gone to problem. We've got a problem identification. We've created solutions around those problems. We've talked about the implications of those solutions, and now it's the incentive part. And so what I would love for people to talk about here in our last few minutes is think about an opportunity that you saw to do something different. A referral that you made that was sort of like outside your job description, something that you did with a family that was above and beyond. Can you talk about how you felt after you did that? How does it feel having that power of understanding of knowing your community resources and having those relationships there? How does it feel to meet someone where they are and to have a conversation, even if that doesn't result in their involvement in the system? Share out how that feels, because this is something we don't talk about enough. I know it's odd to talk about in this space, but feeling is a different word for incentive, and incentive is how we get culture change to happen. Beautiful and authentic. I want you to think about, for those of you who are still pondering how to contribute to the conversation, if I thought about my job as prosecutor before sort of like the light came on, if I thought about my days standing in court processing cases, trying cases, I don't know that I could have reflected on it and said it's beautiful and authentic. That is the drug. That there's beauty, that there's authenticity, that sure, there is a whole ton of failure. I don't want to leave you with this idea that if you subscribe to doing something different, that we are just going to go to this new world where everything is successful. But what I can promise you is the more that you can increase the beauty and authenticity, those feelings, the more you will be able to withstand the failure. And when you withstand the failure, you are able to learn from it as opposed to being beat down by it. Because when we're beat down by it, that's when we develop a shell. That's when we are not our best selves. When people are coming into our systems, that's when we are losing patience with people. And when we lose patience, that's trust. Amarina, it's not easy. No, it is not easy. It is not easy at all. And I really appreciate that you saying that. That's vulnerable. Vulnerability is an amazing leadership skill. It is not easy, but I'm for anyone who needs to hear this out loud. Doing what we do now is not easy. And so what I'm offering is not an easier way to get to results. What I'm saying is when you are getting bashed up against the rocks, having just a little bit more sunlight breaking through that storm makes the bashing a little bit more tolerable. Motivated, love it. The youth felt that I heard what they were saying was helpful. Makes coming to work the next day a whole lot easier. Randy, amazing. And I love how you contextualize that. The youth felt that I heard. We lose a lot of people just by not giving them an opportunity to be heard. We don't have to agree with them. We don't have to like what they're saying, but giving people the opportunity to be heard is like the thing that most people say, I wish I had the opportunity to say what I wanted to say. And so that's really powerful. Tara, feels good to tell a youth or parent that they're doing it right. Give a compliment. The smile is a good feeling. The simple things. It's right. Creature comfort. I think the best feeling is when a youth or a parent trusts you enough to have an honest and open conversation with you. They volunteer information you would not ask and listen to response. Again, that feeling of trust, that feeling of seeing someone smile, and this is where the analog breaks down a bit more for the bartender analog, but because we do work in places of despair, but that smile, that currency that we get, that's not money, but that smile, that comfort, that trust, is something that is much more valuable than money. Is something that will motivate us to go to work the next day. And when that happens, it is a God thing working through me and not from me. Beautiful, Randy. I love that. And Mandy is offering, I experienced pushback from other people in the system, but it was because I was doing what they were not and should have been. I believe it raised the bar for all professionals. When you push to make a difference, never stop. And Mandy, I can't really think of a better way to end our time today, because what you're talking about is modeling behavior. And that is not to shame other people. In fact, when you take the courageous first step of doing what Mandy is talking about, and all of you who have shown up here and participated today, what you will find is that there are so many more people out there just like you. There are so many more people that are willing to support you, to join you, to follow you. But they, just like you, were reticent to do it until you did it. And when they see you do it and they come on your team, now you have capital. And so I really want to thank you all for spending your time with me today. I know it was a long day. I know that you've got a lot to think about. But again, my name is Adam Foss. My organization is designed to give trainings to prosecutors, but it's the worst thing I ever did was name my organization Prosecutor Impact, because the training that we provide works for anybody who shows up in the morning with the intention of doing good, but was never given the tools and the resources to do that good in the way that we're talking about today. I am looking forward to coming to any part of Nebraska to work with you all. But in the time being, I am just an email or a direct message away. Please feel free to follow me on social media. I put a lot of resources in there, but I also just put a lot of stories in here. And if you need to use my stories to make points to your leadership, please do. That's what they're out there for. Thank you, everyone. And regardless of what happens with this election, just understand that the state of our union, particularly our criminal justice system, particularly our child welfare system, has been the same regardless of who the president is. It's up to us to be the new civil rights leaders of our time. It is not going to go away. The problem is not just going to get better because there's a new person sitting on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It's going to be about individual actions by each one of you and your offices tomorrow, but it doesn't have to wait until tomorrow. Go home, tell your kids you love them tonight. I appreciate all of you. Thank you.